This 1, 2, 3.
Welcome to all our comrades around the world to the Socialist Sunday Stream.
Hello everyone, I think that we're live. Today we have...
Finally.
Welcome to the Sunday Socialist Stream. Today we have Breht from Revolutionary Left Radio and we have Paul with us. Abby couldn't make it today, but we're super excited to talk to Breht. If anyone hasn't already checked it out, Breht has an amazing podcast called Revolutionary Left Radio. It's amazing. And thank you for joining us. I guess we'd first like to start by asking you about how you came over to the left. Were you always left wing since you were young, or what was your transition over to the left?
And also an introduction if you want, baby.
Oh yeah, and you can introduce
unplug the shows, all of the shows, like Red Menace, everything.
It's all in the description box as well, so yeah.
So very quickly, I am Breht O'Shea. I host RevLeftRadio, a revolutionary left radio, and I co-host a podcast called Red Menace, podcast/YouTube thing with Allison Escalante called Red Menace. So thank you both so much for having me on. I'm really humbled that you want to have me on, and humbled that you're excited to have me on.
Come on, man.
It's really cool. Yeah.
Mighty Breht.
So I do appreciate it. But so to answer your question though. Oh.
Sorry about that.
You good?
Yeah.
That's okay. Okay. Yeah, just to answer your question, I how I came to the left, I really grew up very working class. Is sort of all I knew. And I would, have experiences that working class people have, like walking home from school to find that your electricity was shut off, or coming home to find my mom like crying on the front porch because her car got repossessed. So I have these really fundamental experiences of what it's like growing up working class. But of course, our popular culture doesn't really give you an outlet through which to understand that. And as I grew, I became more and more interested in politics, just sort of like, 14, 15, just taking in anything at all. And I would listen to like conservative talk radio. And my dad used to listen to that on our trip from Nebraska to Montana. So it'd be like 13 hours of like, AM conservative talk radio, which in retrospect is a form of torture. But at the time, I was sort of passively being influenced by talk radio, like what works in talk radio, how you connect with people through a purely auditory medium, etc. And then just as I grew up, I had my own child at 19, and that sort of really puts life in perspective. And I've always, even as an adult, struggled in the working class. And so, it was really just like all those experiences. And then I got to a certain point where I could actually investigate for myself some political theories outside of what were offered in the mainstream society, which is just liberalism or conservatism. And I could go on forever. I guess I did have a really fundamental experience. After I was hospitalized for depression, my dad, who was living in Montana at the time, took me up to Montana, and I got to live for about 6 to 8 months on the very edge of the Crow Reservation up in Montana. And so I really had a first-person experience of the indigenous struggles, the sort of poverty of the reservation, and just sort of got to be introduced to that entire world. Wow. And when I came back, that was also very influencing. So a bunch of different stuff. And then eventually I started reading, and all of my past experiences made the most sense in a broadly left-wing perspective.
Wow, that's really, really important. And you did start reading. Can I ask, what were the texts that started you getting into leftism? Were there any particular texts? Did you just jump in to like the Communist Manifesto, or was there something else that got you first?
Yeah, I did have an experience with the Communist Manifesto when I was like too young to understand it. So like I remember being like a teenager and getting it and reading the entire thing and not understanding a goddamn word of it. So that was an experience. But I think what really got me into it, and when I really started getting traction with regards to reading, I actually came in through Chomsky. I think I was about 18, 19 when the financial crash happened, and I was really trying to understand it. Beautiful, exactly.
We've all been there. Manufacturing consent phase.
Exactly. I think the first one I read was Profits Over People.
Yeah.
And and so that really started orienting myself to what a radical critique of the status quo could possibly look like. And so even as I've evolved, and maybe I have my disagreements with Chomsky, I'm still one of those people that understands how important he is for myself and for so many other people getting into this stuff. And he has a lot of really good stuff when it comes to American actions abroad. And as you held up manufacturing consent, which is really helpful to understand media, etc. So Chomsky was a huge doorway for me.
Wow.
Yeah, he's an interesting one. He seems to be pretty mainstream. Like he's one of the only like real mainstream sort of quote unquote, I don't know, radicals we can say, who seems to get like airplay. And I suppose it's changing now. I think guys like Richard Wolff and stuff like that are getting out there and actually, you know, using the term Marx and things like that. Yeah. But yeah, for a long time I think he was the only hard hitter, you know.
Yeah,
and the mainstream.
I think it's really interesting as well that you say how you came over to the left, because I think so often when I ask people how they came to the left, it tends to be things that like people viscerally being able to experience some sort of suffering or stuff that really hits people in the gut emotionally, rather than information alone or just like reading about things. And I think that on the left, maybe we often focus on information much more than really appealing to people's like hearts or like feelings or more on a subjective level. So, I mean, we need both, obviously, but I think that that's really interesting as well.
Yeah. No, I actually think...
sorry. You go.
Okay. Oh, yeah, really quickly. I actually think that's incredibly important, that, you know, there is this over-intellectualization and this over-focus on the cerebral aspects of theory and leftism. And what I try to do with Rev Left and from the very beginning was connect those intellectual, theoretical points up with, like, as you said, emotion, with the heart, with the sort of narrative that helps people make sense of their own life. And hopefully will stop people from thinking that, you know, their poverty or their struggles are a product of their bad character, and instead start to shift that to actually, I live inside a certain context, which really limits what I can and can't do. And I think to get across to people, especially people who don't know the theory, who don't necessarily want to be lectured to, is to tap into emotion and to tap in really lived experiences as poor and working or marginalized people. And so I found a lot of success doing that. And I think a lot of people on the left now are really seeing the value in connecting that up with, you know, the heart and the emotions and the lived experience. And I think that's a really beautiful and important move that the left is making in North America at the moment.
Yes, absolutely.
Hearts and minds, right?
Yeah. And so you've had such an interesting journey in terms of your kind of tendency, I guess. So you were at some point a non-authoritarian anarchist, am I right? And then you were also like a libertarian socialist or libertarian Marxist. And now you identify more as a Marxist-Leninist-Maoist. So how did you sort of go from one to the other, and what led you to be where you are today?
Yeah, I was corrupted. You know, I started as a pure, beautiful libertarian socialist. I was degraded to a disgusting authoritarian.
Yeah, the postmodern neo-Marxists.
Yeah, exactly.
They got you.
Yeah. So my journey was, before I started Rev Left, in my early 20s, I gravitated towards democratic socialism, and I was even a card-carrying member of the DSA, like well before the Bernie's presidential run and the explosion of the DSA in my early 20s. And then in my early to mid 20s, I shifted towards anarchism, a more radical critique, leading down sort of the more fundamental critiques of the status quo that maybe democratic socialism didn't fully offer. And by the time I started RevLeftRadio, I think I had just read the book by Terry Eagleton called Why Marx is Right. And it's a great book, and I'd always loved Marx, right? But I always prevented myself from calling myself a Marxist because of the sort of historical burden that gets lobbed at you the moment you start just, what about Stalin? What about
every time?
So I held off for a long time identifying with it, even though I was so informed by the Marxist tradition. And so, I started Rev Left, calling myself a libertarian Marxist. And then just discussion after discussion with a broad range of people all across the left spectrum, continue to study, continue to learn from all these amazing experts and people in their fields and organizers on the ground. And what really started bringing me over to Marxism, and then Marxism-Leninism, and then Marxist-Leninist-Maoism, I think, is really the sort of strategic and tactical coherency and primacy that is placed on strategy in those traditions. When you think of Lenin and Mao, who were really not only participating themselves in actual world historical revolutions, but were theorizing in real time as they did it. And so that strategy and the notion that good theory doesn't just come from an armchair. You don't just sit back, especially in the imperial core, and just have flights of fancy that lead to political theory. Political theory is forged through actual revolutionary practice, and the heights of that practice are full-on revolutions, successful revolutions like we saw in the Soviet Union and in Mao's China. And so that really meant a lot to me, and I started really taking that seriously. Like, the sort of theorists that I need to listen to are the ones that are actually doing stuff in the real world and making those changes, because I think there's more value in that than just, people coming up with ideas, which anybody can do all day long. I was a philosophy undergrad, so I know exactly how that goes. And then also just understanding how many people, especially in the global South, have been able to successfully use the traditions of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism to liberate themselves from colonialism, liberate themselves from various forms of oppression and domination, huge anti-imperialist struggles like the one in Vietnam against French and then American colonizers in the Vietnam War was really, huge for me. And then just how anti-imperialism is really built into Marxism, Leninism, and of course taken on board with Maoism as well, that this notion that imperialism is what capitalism does on the international stage, and that to have a really good understanding of capitalism requires a really deep understanding, in my opinion, of imperialism. And so all of those things coming together really started pushing me more and more in the ML and MLM direction, I think. Yeah.
That's a hell of a journey that you made there, Brett. And yeah, you're totally right. I think getting out and doing like real world things will really change your ideas and your attitudes towards these values that we often start off with. I mean, like, I think one of the biggest things that we often start off with, like if you're coming from like an anarchist or libertarian perspective, is like, all hierarchy's bad. You just start off with that idea in mind, and then you're like out there and like you're sort of on the street organizing, and you're like, oh, hey, hang on a minute now, and then then it sort of comes into the just hierarchies, right? So all unjust hierarchy is bad, and then I feel like you start to realize, hang on, there's a lot more hierarchies that are justifiable than I might have previously thought beforehand, and
yeah.
How did you come from that? How did you overcome that sort of that thing that like we can often do sort of on the libertarian socialist side, where we often say like, oh, that's authoritarian. That's just that thing, that buzzword that we use. The second someone talks about like centralizing things, about someone taking charge, taking control, someone starts talking about vanguardism or mass lines or things like this, people can often just straight away just say that's authoritarian. And how did you, as someone who identified as an anarchist, overcome that? Was that through RevLeftRadio, through meeting up with people from different organizations, or maybe like a combination of all of the above?
Yeah, I think it probably was a combination. Certainly when I started engaging with people who identified with Leninism or Maoism, the critiques against authoritarianism, the word and the way it's used, started coming to the fore, and I really started wrestling with that idea. And I also noticed how a lot of times these movements, either historically or presently, that are more or less good and deserve our support, are immediately called authoritarian by the mainstream media as a way to sort of tap into that little part of the American brain that, it will buzz bright red when you hear that word authoritarian. And I also started looking at, who's our enemy? And our enemies, capitalists, fascist, imperialist, the most authoritarian people in the world, but they're also highly organized. They're highly militant. They will employ violence at any moment, even against children, in pursuit of their own interests. They're highly funded. They're structured. They're actually, when it comes to war and fighting for their interests, the hierarchy and the level of organization that our enemies have comes to their benefit. And when you look at something like Occupy Wall Street, for example, I was a part of it. As much as I could have been in Omaha, huge marches, all that stuff. But you do see the limitations. You have this capitalist state. The capitalist state is highly organized. It's militant. It's ready for fucking conflict. Sorry, can we cuss?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Fuck yeah. I'm an Irishman. It's part of my tradition. It's part of my culture.
There we go.
I think you're tapping into your cultural heritage, I think.
Exactly. But yeah, so you saw how Occupy really trying to implement this horizontalism, this total consensus decision making format into a situation where it just didn't work, and our opponents being more organized than we were won. And when you're talking about global capitalism and imperialism, it's not so much the hierarchy that we really love or anything, but it's the organization, and sometimes that organization, especially in periods of conflict, requires some level of hierarchy, the party hierarchy, having everybody in a party on the same page, even if we have internal disagreements about this or that step, to say, okay, we've already had this debate internally, we've voted, we've come to a conclusion. Now let's move as one. Because if we let that individualism creep back in, if we let that self-concern creep back in, well, my ideas are more important than actually the progressive steps that we can make collectively, that ruins an organization, it ruins a party, it ruins the revolutionary movement. And I think one of the reasons that especially, Western movements in the US and Canada and in Europe, that they hit these limitations is often because on some level they have embraced and fully absorbed the concept of individualism, and it pops up and manifests into our movements and eats it away from the inside. And so all of those considerations really pushed me in that direction. And then I really started thinking, okay, anarchists talk a lot about hierarchy, and for some anarchists, that's their starting point. But I was like, Marxism says that class should be the starting point. Class trumps hierarchy. If we can make a proletarian movement that can really advance on our enemies and make real gains for the working class people, but it requires hierarchy to some degree to get there, well, hell, I'm more than welcome to use a little bit of hierarchy for the more important thing, which is the class struggle, And the last thing I'll say is I think the mistake, and it's not only an anarchist mistake, lots of people do it all over the political spectrum, is to come to a movement with a priori commitments, like hierarchy is always bad, the state is always bad, never vote because, no matter what, voting is a bad thing. And what Lenin really teaches is this is a sort of childish, left-wing communism and infantile disorder. He critiques this idea, and he's like, strategy and being tactical means coming to the situation as it actually is, and then using the material conditions as your starting point, not a priori abstract ideological commitments, and that also spoke to me a lot. So.
Yeah, I've definitely, I totally agree with you. And especially when we talk about things like authority and hierarchy and all of these things, that Engels text, like on authority. I mean, like this was dealt with like 150 years ago or something like that, and it rings through today. But holding that dogma in your mind, I think like you're really gonna run into a lot of problems when you start organizing in real life. If you do maintain those dogmas, getting onto the streets and trying to organize and trying to be militant and stuff,
Yeah, and I would say that by no means is an anarchist problem by itself. Like, there are plenty, if not more, dogmatic Marxists, and that's also something that I use my show and my platform to fight against, the dogmatism inherent in Marxism, because dogmatism, even when it's not this a priori commitment exact style, it's still a form of to bring ideas to the table first and then make them fit into the material world. And I think you get that exactly backwards. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's a real problem with kind of like vulgar materialist, or the very orthodox Marxists. Yeah, it's totally. Sorry, Catherine, I've kind of been grabbing things here. Do you want to jump in and?
I wanted to ask you. So I really love that about your podcast in general, that you're very much always saying that you're very anti-dogmatic, anti-sectarianism, everything like that. But how do you think that in practice, or even in theory, we can sort of reconcile the differences between different tendencies, anarchists, Marxists, etc. Because I really believe in working with everyone that isn't obviously not people that are incredibly problematic, but that is because we all have fundamentally the same goal, the slight variations, but we all want an anti-capitalist kind of communist future. So how do you think that we can kind of work together, or how do you think that we can reconcile some of those differences? And Yeah,
that's a great question. I think to even get off the ground here, I think there has to be some intellectual humility, right? Like you can be confident and you can be dedicated and you can be committed to a certain tendency and a certain way of doing things and a certain set of theories. But at the end of the day, we're all flawed human beings with incomplete knowledge just by virtue of who we are as human beings. And so, I think a big thing that you can do to get started in this direction and also fight against dogmatism is to have a sort of intellectual humility. Like, yes, I've done all this stuff with organizing and studying theory, but I still have so much more to learn. I don't know more than I do know,
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
if you can keep that
Totally.
sort of in the forefront of your mind, it can give you a good direction into this broader question. And then to address your broader question, I think with different tendencies, we should not paper over those differences, right? Sometimes you will see left unity propped up to basically just excuse or ignore or obscure the real differences that exist between certain tendencies and the real history of actual conflict that has erupted between us at different times. But at the same time, we also have to look where we actually are in terms of the class struggle in the U.S. Or I'm speaking from the U.S., so I use that as my sort of baseline. Where we at and where we're actually at is way the fuck far behind. Like our enemies are in power, our worst enemies are in power. The fascists are on the rise. Imperialists are going buck wild in the face of late capitalist contradictions. And so to hyper emphasize the tyranny of small differences, I think, is a mistake at this juncture. And so we should work together on things that we agree on, which is a lot. Anarchist and Marxist, we overlap on a lot. It's like this 20% or this 10% that we, hate each other over. But, you really have to find what you agree on and work together on those common fronts. We all hate fascists. That's a great place to start. We all are anti-capitalist. And I hope to God that we're all anti-imperialist. And so those are huge, huge pillars, and we should be able to work together on those things. And in the past, you can look at like the Spanish Civil War, for example. A popular front was often utilized. So even when it comes to working with social democrats, right, Bernie type dem socialists, when we have interests that overlap, we should work together on those interests. And we can, and I think we really should. But I think where it hits its limitation, at least from a Marxist perspective, is once we get to the point where a Marxist party emerges, right, where there's mass support, the class struggle's ramping up, huge chunks of the proletariat have started to be mobilized and have their class consciousness raised a bit. And then the Marxist urge is then to go form a party. Now, in a party context, I don't think that you can have anarchists and Marxists. First of all, anarchists would say, fuck you.
Yeah.
we're not joining the goddamn party.
Yeah.
And then Marxists would be like, well, this is the cool kids club anyway. We're not allowing you in. And, so they can get kind of silly, but I do think that a big strength in the sort of motor of a Marxist political party in the proper sense is its theoretical coherency. And the mistake of trying to do a big tent all the way through the Occupy, or even like the Democratic Party, is premised on like a cross-class big tent where you have like billionaires like fucking Michael Bloomberg in the same party with working class people who can barely afford rent, and they think that's going to be tenable. Well, we see it's not. And so I do believe the Marxist comes out at me at some level and says, yes, we can work together on all these different things, and we should, but at some point in the development of the class struggle, our big differences will come up. What do we do with the state? How do we organize formally? And those things will be, we can't wrinkle over or ignore or try to, put our heads in the sand and look the other way.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Totally.
So well said. Someone, a guest in the chat just asked, and I think it's a great question, how do MLMs make sure that we end up with workers owning the means of production instead of things going the state capitalist way as it always seems to have?
Yeah, great question. So when I'm thinking of the past of proletarian movements, right? When I think of Russia and China, what I'm not saying is that they've figured it all out. I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm not saying that they've made no mistakes or that they even didn't do terrible, horrific shit or make, world historical blunders. All of those things did occur. I'm just saying that they are a genuine part of proletarian history, and we should take them seriously, not ignore them and dismiss them because they're quote unquote authoritarian. And I think what Maoism really adds to the Marxist-Leninist conception is you see Leninism in the Soviet Union hit this sort of wall, right? Where this sort of bureaucracy arose and power was consolidated into too few hands. We saw the purges of the old Bolsheviks. And then we saw revisionism take hold in the party. And then we get all the way down, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union collapses. The 90s are the fucking worst decade ever for Russians, etc.
Yep.
And so you see that Leninism hit a historical limitation. What Maoism tried to do was really take account of that. Okay, Leninism got us this far. They're right about the party. They're even right about the state. But how do we fight against this bureaucracy? How do we stop our proletarian movements from being just top down? And that's not to say that that's a fair analysis of the Soviet Union, because in a lot of ways there was a lot of bottom up support, even for Stalin, which is interesting. But Mao really tried to take this thing further and tried to experiment with it. And what we saw was stuff like the Cultural Revolution. This attempt to put power in the hands of the people. Mao said, rebel against the party itself. Can anybody imagine Stalin saying that? Absolutely not. So, as much as a lot of libertarian socialists will think of Mao and Stalin as the exact same thing and call Mao a disgusting authoritarian, in a lot of ways, Mao was trying to figure out this dialectic between top-down leadership, which I think is essential, and bottom-up mass participation, which I think is crucially essential. If I had to pick between the two, I would even go for bottom-up. Like, that's where my deep sympathies lie. But I do believe in powerful leadership, and I do believe that is a requirement to fight the sort of enemies that we have. So I think, to get to your question, Maoism does take seriously this idea that power should be in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the state, and certainly not in the hands of the bureaucracy. But because they're experiments, and because these are the first sort of sputtering starts of pro-revolution the world has ever seen, of course they're going to fail. Of course they're going to hit their limitations. And our job is not to say, oh, those things failed, therefore let's look in a totally different direction and not learn anything. Our thing is like, okay, those failed. Why did they fail? When did they fail? How did they fail? How have subsequent movements tried to build on those failures and turn them into successes? What things do we jettison from the Stalin era? What things do we jettison from the Mao era? And what things do we keep and move forward with? And so I think that is really our position when we say that we're Leninists and we're Maoists, is not that we agree with everything those states did or anything like that, but it's like, that is our tradition. That is our history. We should be honest about that, take account of it, and learn from it,
Yeah, these were experiments, we need to keep on going with this. We need to take a scientific approach and move forward, right? Yeah, that's actually, it's really interesting that we're talking about power like from the ground up now. Recently, I've seen a lot of movements that are pushing this. Now, these movements that are sort of pushing sort of a bottom-up, people-powered approach tend to be kind of Trotskyist. Like, for example, People Before Profit in Ireland. And they're kind of like an unorthodox Trotskyist organization. And they really push this like people power narrative, often at the expense of like any top-down stuff. Like they're kind of like, no, we're not doing any top-down stuff. And they're really like bottom-up. Like it's all about getting it bottom-up. They're part of the Socialist Workers Network. People Before Profit is kind of like this kind of front group for the Socialist Workers Network, which is part of, I think, like the International Socialist Organization or something like that. But it is very much this Trotskyist kind of thing. So I'm kind of interested to know, do you have any thoughts on this? This is kind of like 21st century socialism that are focusing on these sort of left populist movements. And do you have any thoughts on those kind of things? And also if you want to jump into some thoughts on Trotskyism as well.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think there's a different context here, because in my experience organizing in the US, certainly the Trotskyist formations do exist, but in all of my organizing and, all of my sort of experience with leftists in the States, Trotskyism doesn't necessarily play a super prominent role. Like here in Omaha, like I have comrades of pretty much every discernible stripe on the left: Democratic, Socialist, Anarchists, Maoist, Leninist, everything in between. But what I really don't think I have is Trotskyist comrades, not because I don't like Trotskyists or that they're not allowed into our group or anything, but just because none really say it. I think there are certain countries that have much more of a Trotskyist presence than the US necessarily does. So I'm actually not super familiar with purely Trotskyist nations. I do have my sort of abstract critiques of Trotskyism. I think we can look at the historical record and see.
I would like to actually, yeah. I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, I don't know that the history of Trotskyism very well, so I'm sort of out of my depth when I'm talking specifically about that. But
I'm sure you know more than us, so you're good.
I do think that the historical record is pretty clear that Trotskyism, which can in some sense be seen as like the same move that Maoism made. Is like, okay, you see what happens in the Soviet Union. It's hit some limitations. Which way do you go? And honestly, at that time, like Trotskyism and anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism, which would evolve into Maoism, were really the two trajectories that we could take. And I think we've seen since then the power of Maoism over the power of Trotskyism. People in the global South specifically, you can think of the Philippines, you can think of Nepal, you can think of South America in some countries. Maoism seems to be a more effective forward movement for the overall communist movement in the world in ways that Trotskyism really hasn't been able to replicate, in like a way that, like, you know, in the Philippines, for example, you have, or in India even, these huge mass movements that support these Maoist movements, right? And you don't see that same efficacy in the Trotskyist tradition, I don't think. Now, again, I'm no expert. I'm sure there's somebody out there just like getting really pissed at me, like, you don't know, 1933, this actually happened. So I'm more than willing to learn more. But that's sort of my general takeaway. I do have a book called Trotskyism and Maoism, which really goes in depth and studies this, but I haven't read it yet. So maybe after I read that, I'll have a better answer to this question.
Yeah. I'm really interested to hear that take, and I think it's really important. Marxist-Leninism, like, for whatever people want to say, Marxism-Leninism has a lot of proven records. It's a formula that works. You know, I'm not saying it always works in the best interest of everyone. I don't think anybody's ever going to say that it's perfect, that there were never any problems. As you said before, it's about learning and it's about growing and it's about honestly accepting mistakes and moving forward with that. But Trotskyism, I don't think, even has that kind of legacy with it, and it's kind of an issue for me in Ireland, because basically all of the major socialist formations are like Trotskyist parties here in Ireland. And we have like the Communist Party of Ireland, and we have the Workers' Party, both of which are Marxist-Leninists. Great guys in both of those great parties, but they're tiny. Like, we're talking like the CPI, Communist Party of Ireland, it's got something like, I don't know, like between 100 and 200 members. Like, that's it, you know? That's it, like in the entire country. That's like the 32 counties, you know. So it's, whereas if you look at like the Trotskyist parties, they've got thousands and thousands of members and thousands of supporters, and of course they keep doing their splits. They split into like 1,000 different groups. You know, like the Judean People's Front, the People's Front Judea shit. You know? They really split up. You know, they really go for it. You know, there was a recent one. There was one recently where one of the guys, Paul Murphy, sort of a prominent Trotskyist socialist in Ireland, he left his party, which was called Solidarity, to form Rise, because he wanted to do like a left unity party. He left his party to create a left unity party, which I know. Okay, fair enough. Like, he was with people who probably didn't want to do it, and you know what I mean. Like, it's kind of, well, it's humorous.
Yeah, it's certainly humorous. Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder what it is about, Irish history specifically, that gives rise to such a strong Trotskyist trend that doesn't really exist here in the U.S. I'm not quite sure what that is, but.
Well, I was going to say that I've noticed that a lot of the Trotskyists I meet in Ireland, a lot of them really, really want to differentiate themselves from like Stalin and from MLs, and they really they're really holding on to sort of liberal ideology. That means they can say fuck Stalin, you know, straight away. That's the first thing that they can say, and I feel like they're always trying to differentiate themselves. I'm like, you're 1 minute into the conversation and they're calling out tankies, you know, they're just like tanky, and it's very, very intense, and you know, I feel like it's part of sort of the Catholic anti-communism that we were sort of for a very long time. Now I don't know how that fits in with the US situation, because obviously it seems that you guys have had much more intense anti-communism in the US. So, like 100 years, you know, the Cold War, McCarthyism, all of these things, you know, Red Scares, left, right, and center, you know. So actually, if anything, it's very interesting to me that there is a stronger communist or Marxist-Leninist movements within the US.
For sure. Yeah, I think a big part of that comes from this idea in Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism of nationhood, of this decolonial struggle that's really a part of our theory. And in the U.S., which Lenin called the jailhouse of nations, you have colonized people in the form of indigenous people, and you have colonized people in the form of black folks stolen from Africa and brought over here for chattel slavery. And those, in that case, settler colonial white supremacist society, these sort of nations within a nation fighting back, especially during like the 60s when the Black Panthers rose and stuff, it really was in conjunction with this global movement of the global South rising up against imperialism, neocolonialism, and capitalism. And it was really situated in that broader context. And so I think in the US, the big strains are that sort of Black Panther, Leninist, Maoist, anti-revisionist strain. You have democratic socialism, which is obviously huge because of like Bernie and whatnot. And then you have anarchism, which is super huge here. But you don't really have Trotskyism in that top three. And so, yeah, it's just interesting. I don't really have a complete answer to that. But I think, as you were saying, there's some certain historical trends in different countries that give rise to it.
That's really really interesting. You know, I'm also really interested that you said that anarchism is huge in the US. That's something that I've noticed as well. I've got like a lot of people who follow me or support me are anarchists, and a lot of them are in the US, and it's quite surprising to me that there's so many anarchists. But then I sometimes wonder if you think that there might be something in the US that leads more people in the US towards anarchism than in other places, because in Ireland anarchism it's very much a minority, sort of. It's very a small group of people who support anarchism. I mean, of course, you've got like syndicalist groups and stuff like that. Anarcho-syndicalism maybe is a little bit bigger, but do you think that there's any particular reason why a lot of people might be so attracted to anarchism in the US? I sometimes think that there might be some connections with like liberalism and individualism and like some sense of idealism, like philosophically. But what do you think? What do you think on these?
Yeah, really, really good question. And because we're sort of flying by the seat of our pants, I haven't not got to sit down and really think this out, but some things do jump to mind. I think one thing that jumps to mind is like the new left movement in the mid 20th century in the US, which, you know, was sort of getting away from more orthodox Marxist stuff. You saw the rise of like environmentalist movements, of identity politics, you know, think 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
Also in the U.S., we have the long history of the IWW. I'm pretty sure it was started here in the U.S., and that was a huge sort of rallying point for workers in the early 20th century that I think still lives on. I was a member of the IWW myself for a few years, and I'm still close comrades with all the IWW and GDC members in my area. And then there is also, I think, that the third point would be sort of what you gestured towards, which is, you know, because we live in this really hyper anti-communist society with all of the anti-communist history of the Cold War and as you said, McCarthyism, etc. There is an impulse in the American mind to sort of be anti-communist in a way that might not exist in other countries as strongly as it does here. And that is sort of, you know, passively absorbed through our education system and everything. And then so when you're coming out of that and you're wanting to radicalize, it's a lot easier, I think, to make the jump to a still very radical. Anarchism is incredibly radical, but it also keeps around certain, depending on the tendency within anarchism, certain liberal things that are just an easier transition to make, like, as you said, sort of individualism. And you really see that rise in like the post-left anarchists and like anarcho-nihilism and stuff like that. You can really see how these things go off the rails a bit. So I think those three and probably a bunch of other variables that I'm not totally accounting for at the moment certainly play a role in that. And, you know, the other thing would be the U.S., we're really coming, as you said, out of this time of the Cold War, out of this time of Red Scare, McCarthyism, out of the Reagan era of the 80s, and then the Clintonism, third wayism of the 90s. And so what we find here in the U.S. is like we don't really have a long tradition of like left formations existing unencumbered for long periods of time. There was like the 80s and 90s were a dead period for the left. And at the very end of the 90s, we saw the Seattle World Trade Organization protest in Seattle, like 99. And that was really like the first, like, hey, we're back, you know. And then we had Occupy, anti-war movement after Iraq War, etc. So in the U.S., there really is, the left is trying to be reborn with very few veterans, organizers and stuff that we can lean on. We're really trying to find our own way. And in that context, I think anarchism also can be very appealing to people who are trying to break out of their conditioning and want to be radical and see some things that they can still be comfortable with in anarchism. Now, I do want to say before I stop talking that I don't want to be unfair to anarchists. There are plenty of anarchists. Some are my very close friends who I would die for. And when I got doxxed by Nazis, just along with my Marxist comrades, I had anarchist comrades backing me up 100%, with weapons and everything. So like, I love my anarchist comrades, and I'm sure they have plenty of critiques of me as well. But so I'll just say that as a caveat.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Much love to anarchists and anarchism and so on.
Sure.
I don't think it came across like you were being dismissive or anything of anarchists, and I hope I haven't come across as dismissive or rude towards anarchists either as well. Lots of love. You guys are great. But yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm always very interested in this conversation. Catherine, do you have anything to jump in? I'm kind of cautious that I might be like,
no, that's no
dominating
worries at all.
or something, or
no,
jumping in too much,
I guess the thing is, recently I've just been so frustrated because I keep wanting some sort of simple solution, or to know exactly what I should be getting involved in, or I guess in my mind I kind of prefer the idea of, like an idealistic type of revolution that's like from the bottom up and like non-hierarchical. But then I think of climate change, and that we only have about 10 years, or probably less even, before climate change becomes irreversible and uncontrollable, and like a mass apocalypse will spread across the globe. And the amount of suffering for so many refugees, and how that will probably lead to so much more fascism and right-wing people thriving, and just the huge amounts of problems that will cause. And then I really feel like just the sense that such an urgency to do something now. But then when I look around, when I look at leftist movements, it often seems like not much is getting done, or at least where I'm living at the moment, I can't see. I go to these leftist spaces and we have like a conversation, and we have some sort of ideas, or like we talk about the problems, but nothing ever comes of it. So I guess I'm kind of curious what you guys think about like what we need to be doing within the next 5 years, or this year, or how we can transform a lot of our leftist spaces, because I really don't know. I'm not really sure, because I know everyone's always like, get in your community and organize, but what does that actually, like, what organize what? And I don't know. I guess these are all very broad questions and kind of difficult to answer, and it totally depends on the context and the place and all of that. But I don't know. I guess we all want some kind of simple solution, but there aren't any simple answers. But yeah, I'm just curious what you think.
Well, I think
So, go ahead.
Sorry, no, you go.
Are you sure? Because you deferred to me last time, so.
Well, I suppose I probably should say it just quickly, and then I'll let you jump in. I think we do run into some of the issues that we had before about, like, are we going to be this tendency or this tendency, like anarchist or Marxist, or what are we going to do? We might have different suggestions for what you can do. Like someone might just say, hey, okay, join your local communist party, get involved here, and make things happen through that. Or some people might say, I don't know, get involved in your local trade union, or some people might say get involved like in your community, things like that. So, and I don't know if they're mutually exclusive. I mean, I think you can definitely do like all of those things, take them all on board. But Brett, sorry, you go ahead, you jump in there.
Yeah, both of what both of you said is really important, and it's something we struggle with. I've been to countless meetings where I walk out feeling pretty disparaged, either at the low number of people that showed up, or just like the lack of direction that we've achieved in that meeting or whatever. And that's an old problem. I mean, I was reading, I think it's called Love and Capital, and it's a biography of Jenny and Karl Marx and just their life. Really, it talks about their politics and all that stuff, but we don't really think about it, but they were organizers before he started being an intellectual that wrote books and stuff. He was an organizer throughout his 20s, getting kicked out of countries, answering like police are knocking on his door at night, and he answers it in his bathrobe with a gun underneath his bathrobe and stuff. Yeah, it's really interesting. I really highly recommend that. I highly recommend that book. But the point is like, you organize as much as you can, no matter what, so that those structures and those networks are there when the time comes where they're necessary. And so even in lulls where you don't have a lot of mass support, like in the US right now, after all these, century of the Cold War and stuff, people aren't just going to they're not knocking down our door to join a communist organization. Right.
Yeah.
But you still have to have that organizational practice. You still have to do those things for when the time comes. And in moments where I'm feeling disparaged, there is this Lenin quote that sort of, boosts my spirits back up and lets me keep my eye on the ball. And he says, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And his point there is you got to be ready no matter what, because it's not that we go out and we evangelize to the world and they're brought over because they believe in our ideas. Some people will be, but for the most part, no. What happens is we organize the most dedicated, most, quote unquote, theoretically and praxis orientedly advanced segments of the working class to come together, and we try to organize the masses and be ready for when the crisis comes, because the next capitalist crisis is always ready to come, right? And we saw in 2007, 2008, that crash happened. There was in the US, there was no organized, real militant resistance to the aftermath of that crash. We did have Occupy, right? But Occupy didn't stop people from getting their homes foreclosed. It didn't stop the banksters from getting bailed out. It didn't stop the capitalist system from continuing on. And so, there it happened. We saw what happened when we tried this pure horizontalism in the face of an economic crisis, which crisis points are the moments where people begin looking for alternatives. And so we popped out as Occupy, and we brought class into the conversation. We catapulted Bernie Sanders to be able to run for president. So I'm not saying it was a total loss, but ultimately that movement was crushed, and capitalism, was not very weakened or threatened at all. And so now we must learn from that. The next crisis is coming. Are we going to replicate those mistakes? Or are we going to say, okay, we've already seen what happens when we try that. Now let's see what happens when we have a little bit more organization when the crisis comes. And as crises start building up on each other, as Catherine said, climate change, right? Think of an economic recession or depression and, climate change intensifying. Those will be real crisis points that can really weaken the overall system. That standing as we are right now, we'd be like, oh, it's never going to come. We should just give up and just retreat into our own personal lives, because what's the point of going to these goddamn meetings, blah, blah, blah. But it's really when the crisis comes that people start looking for alternatives, and we got to be there with our arms out saying, hey, we know how to distribute and produce food. We know how to organize. We have some theoretical coherency and historical knowledge that can lead us in the struggle, etc. And the way I'll end this is also just emphasizing what is so essential in Maoism especially, but also in Leninism, is mass work. And what that means is when you're organizing, you can organize, you can stand on the side of the street and hand out newspapers to people walking by. You can organize a Facebook chat or something, right? But the most effective sort of organizing, especially in the time that we're at right now, is to actually go into marginalized and working class and poor communities and serve them. Serve their needs, make sure they have food, make sure their kids have backpacks for school, make sure they have coats for winter, go form tenant organizations where you go and you fight on behalf of tenants against slumlords, which God knows we have a million of in this world, and totally. By doing that, you actually connect up with real members of our class. You serve their actual real material interests. And by serving their actual material interests instead of just talking at them, that's how you bring them over. And so they might not become a full-on communist waving the red flag on day one, but when that crisis comes, right, and they're looking for alternatives, they see fascism on the rise, they see the center falling out, they see liberals are utterly incompetent and unable to do anything, and they say, hey, those communists over there, remember they fed us and they gave my daughter a backpack for school? Maybe they had the right idea. That's the sort of hopeful, cautious optimism that I think we have to have, and we have to continue doing the work even in the gravest of periods, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, when we have to be ready. That's how I think about it, at least.
Hell yes, that was so
I love
good.
That. I feel so inspired.
I really want. I was going to ask you your thoughts about vanguardism versus the mass line, but I think you kind of already touched on that a little bit there, getting out into communities and then doing all these things. And I'm conscious of the fact that we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Sure.
So I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you one thing about. You mentioned Bernie Sanders and the rise of democratic socialism, quote unquote democratic socialism, in the US. And I just gave away my thoughts on it a little bit. But I wanted to ask what your thoughts were. Sorry, I feel like I've just given you a guided answer or a guided question a little bit now. Tell me, what do you think the best things were about the USSR? Totally objective questioning here. So could you tell me what do you think about the rise of quote unquote democratic socialism in the US with like Bernie, and maybe also about like I suppose like Labour in the UK as well, and Corbyn and all these kinds of things. What do you think about that as someone who is like a scientific socialist, a materialist, Marxist? How do you feel about seeing this mass wave of support for what's being called democratic socialism?
Yeah, well, this is one area where I think sectarianism really fails us, is because there's this impulse to be like, I'm a Marxist, whatever, and therefore the DSA is something that is a problem for us. They're misleading people. They're giving them the wrong definition of socialism, etc. But from a broader perspective, what's really happening is, in the face of capitalist crisis and this disgusting way that working people have to live in this goddamn society, you see a bunch of different people looking for alternatives. And so, of course, that is going to mean a bunch of different formations all across the left spectrum. It's absurd to think that everybody's going to collapse into our one tendency and will gloriously lead the revolution forward. So the emergence of the DSA and really their success, to me, is actually a good indication. It's a good indication because, as much as I have disagreements with social democracy, and I've talked about that at length, it still shows that they're reclaiming the word socialism. They're taking organization really seriously. We were talking earlier about the problems of Occupy, and the DSA, they have their solution to it, right? Like Marxists, like Leninist-Maoists, and the DSA have at least this in common: we believe in organization. We really do believe in organization, even if it is hierarchical on some level or whatever it may be. It's not pure horizontalism and pure consensus decision making that we're after. We take seriously this idea that our class needs to be organized, and to some extent, the most advanced of our class are the ones that are going to do the organizing most of the time. So that's kind of interesting, right? They put class forward, and they put class at the forefront of American politics, which is really hard to do and is an achievement in its own right, which again, it was fueled, I think, in part by Occupy. 99% versus the 1%, et cetera. We put that back into the American sort of lexicon, where class for the last 80s and 90s was really pushed out of the whole equation. So they take organization seriously, they take class seriously. They have a lot of deficiencies, and I think they put too much hope in the electoral system. And they also don't necessarily think through the implications of, I did this episode called What If Bernie Wins? And the goal of that episode was to really, not to be unfair or attack the DSA, but to really think through the implications of their strategy. Okay, Bernie wins. Now what? Well, then we have the political revolution. Okay, how does that look? Bernie even says himself, we need to have, if I'm going to succeed at all and be anything different from just another disappointing Obama, we're going to have mass participation at the grassroots level. The DSA does take that seriously in that they do organize on the grassroots level, but I think they sometimes, at least some of them, can underestimate just how much pushback they are going to get. Look how much pushback Obama got. Now, yes, racism did play a role, but politically he was a neoliberal, and he was called by the right a communist, a Kenyan Muslim Brotherhood extreme, all this crazy shit. Yeah. And so, as I say in that episode, it's hard to think that the right won't outdo themselves this time when you have a Jewish socialist in the White House, right? Imagine the conspiracy theories and the anti-Semitism that will erupt from the right. And then on the left, the Democratic Party, they fucking hate Bernie. They don't want Bernie to win. They're fucking scared as shit that Bernie's going to beat Biden, and they don't want that to happen. And so, whereas Obama had the full defense of the Democratic Party at his back, no matter how hard things got, Bernie won't even have that. And so that really means that if there's going to be any success at all to the Bernie administration, it will have to be undergirded fundamentally by a real uprising from the level of the grassroots, pushing on all fronts and trying to understand this political project as not a fundamentally electoral one, but the electoral victory is merely the first step in a more robust confrontation with capital. For once in this country, the left might be able to go on the offensive. And that's pretty awesome. But I would be so heartbroken if Bernie wins and we just say, okay, he's in power, he'll do the right policies, now I can go back to my regular life. No, if that happens, then Bernie will be a 4-year president, just like Obama. Everybody's going to be disappointed in him. The right will have their time of reaction. We got Trump after Obama. What do we get after Bernie?
Yeah.
So
Jesus.
I love the DSA. The DSA is an essential formation. I understand why they exist. They should exist. In a lot of ways, they do really important work, but there are structural limitations to their entire approach that I think will eventually bite them in the ass if they're not wholly prepared for it.
God damn, Brett, you're so fucking wholesome and open and kind towards like all of the groups. This is really nice, because I think this sort of suggests an answer to what Catherine was asking a little bit earlier on in terms of like left unity and like coalition building and working together and not being too critical and sectarian and always attacking other leftists or left formations or saying things like they're not really left all the time and like this kind of shit. And I think you really do live and embody that sort of attitude. Like I know like you've had this on like many times where you'll have like in conversation with anarchism or in conversation with libertarian socialism. I think you did like the podcast for like Seriously Wrong and stuff like that. And so I think that's really important that we are talking to these people, that we are having these open conversations with people, even people who might be like social democrats or democratic socialists or whatever,
Yeah.
I was one once, right? I was one once.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's something that often a lot of leftists fail to realize. So many people are so critical of like liberals and immediately just like shutting them down, telling them that they're stupid or ignorant, or like the same to like other like more conservative people. But I feel like it makes much more sense to like empathize and understand where they're coming from, and that like most of us didn't come out of the womb as revolutionaries. Like we were like it took a long time, like ignorance is manufactured throughout society. So yeah, it kind of frustrates me that there's like such a tendency to like immediately get so angry with everyone. I do think with people like Bernie and Corbyn, I mean, I do think throughout the UK there has been such a resurgence in, I mean, like the Labour Party had so many more members now, and like socialism and the idea of more leftist ideas are so much more normalized. So I do think it can bring about this like normalization of these concepts that we otherwise would never see if we had like someone like Tony Blair on the left again or something like that. So I do think that people like Bernie and Corbyn do play an incredibly important role. But yeah, that can't be the only thing that we're focusing on. Or yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so it's 8:00 now. Will we wrap things up? I'm not sure if there's anything more that people want to ask or wanted to say. Was there anything else? Catherine, do you have any questions? Or Brett, if you have any questions, if you want to say anything or to get anything out there before we do like the links and the plugs and all that stuff.
I guess my only question would be any sort of recommendations of things to read or check out that you would really recommend people in the chat and we would have a look at.
Sure. Yeah, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, Why Marx Was Right by Terry Eagleton. It's really good, even if you're not like a hardcore anything, you just want to learn, or even if you just want to get a different perspective on it, because although Terry Eagleton himself is not a Leninist or a Maoist, he is just a Marxist. He's a Marxist humanist, really. But he tackles the idea of like every chapter of that book is a criticism of Marxism. Like, well, Marxism led to this much suffering and death. And then that whole chapter is just Terry Eagleton responding to that critique from a Marxist humanist perspective. So it's really accessible to non-Marxist and to anarchists and to like democratic socialists. And it's really helpful. Even if you don't walk away calling yourself a Marxist, you'll still at least have a better understanding of who we are and what we stand for. And, we're not these stereotypes of like these power hungry authoritarians who just want to take over the working class movement so we can bend it to our own will and ends. That's not who we are at all. And so that book really helps people, I think, at least get on the first steps towards understanding that. And then the second thing I would recommend is our sister podcast, Red Menace. What we do with that program is every month we will take a text of political theory, Lenin's imperialism, Mao's On Contradiction, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and we'll break it down into 3 parts. The first part, we explain the text, literally teach the text. The second part, we ask each other questions about the text. And then the third part, we actually apply the lessons of the text to our contemporary material conditions. And so if you're really interested in taking a deep dive in theory, I think it is more advanced than RevLeft. It's a little bit more intellectually rigorous, and so it's more difficult. And so there's less people that listen to that show than RevLeft because it's a little less accessible, but it is challenging in a good way. And I would recommend people who really want to get into really studying political theory to get into it possibly that way. We made the show to help people to get through that stuff. So yeah, those would be my recommendations.
Yeah, and totally want to endorse that as well. Absolutely. Yourself and Alison are fantastic on Red Menace. Brett, I'm like a long-term listener. I've been listening since 2017. I cycle to work every day listening to Rev Left, like
That's amazing.
Long-term, you've really, really helped shape my development, like politically, and I'm just really, really appreciative for you for doing that. I'm really, really appreciative for you coming on today. I really thank you so much for being here, for having this conversation. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Catherine.
I was just going to say it's been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much from listening to you. So thank you so much for joining us and supporting smaller creators as well.
No, thank you both so much for having me on. I do want to say that when you actually texted me to invite me on, I had my YouTube pulled up and I'd already been subscribed to your channel. So like your face was literally on the screen when I got like the message, like, would you be willing to come on? Like I told my wife about it and shit. It's just funny. The love and solidarity goes both ways for sure.
Solidarity, man. That's fucking great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much to everybody who's in the stream, the chat in the stream. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope this isn't. I hope we can do something like this again. We can stay involved. We can stay in touch. And and all the best for the future. Everybody, go check out Rev Left and Red Menace. I think there's links in the description box below now. Give them love. Go give them a $1 or $2 a month on Patreon. Help support your fellow workers of the world. And
right.
hell yeah.
Thank you so much. Solidarity.
Bye.
Solidarity.
Bye.
All right, gang. Thanks very much. See you guys.
See ya.